Fluffy Pants says hello. He's a little rambunctious. Do you guys remember when he was just a little kitty? He came along in January of 2023. So he's coming up on 3.5 years old. He's matured and blossomed into quite a cat, frisky and risky and purry and furry. I had gone a long time without a male cat. I preferred female cats. They seem to be better natured, less likely to cause trouble. And this kitten was marketed to me as a female cat. I think you guys remember that his name originally was Luna. And then the people that gave him to me, they actually lovingly lied to me and told me that he was a female cat. Anyway, I'm not really digressing because the topic this week is the shocking, burdensome, troublesome, irksome topic of God's will. God's will. I have a friend who says, I don't need willpower, I need won't power. But anyway, we could wax eloquent on God's will for weeks and weeks and weeks, but we'll spend this week studying this provocative, interesting topic that there's so many different angles on it and so many different points of view and so many people who think it's a terrible idea and so many people who think it's the greatest idea in the world. And that's what I'm aiming for. May each and every one of us participating find new insight and new connection and new understanding and perhaps new willingness for whatever God's will is. And to me, the phrase do God's will sounds about as conventionally religious as anything I've ever heard in my entire life. I think when I was younger, the idea of any organized or conventional religion, you gonna bite me, was just absurd. The very notion of it was impossible to even consider, and especially something called God's will. Could anything be more burdensome and more onerous than to have some cosmic tyrant imposing his will upon me and forcing me to do what I didn't want to do? Because I don't know about you guys, but my 20s and 30s were largely characterized by I'm going to kind of try to do whatever I want because it's the only way I can come close to getting any sort of satisfaction out of life. That didn't go so well for me. That sort of ended in a bit of a, how shall we say, crash and burn phase, because in my pursuit of, I guess you would call it my will. I guess if there's God's will, the other side of the coin would be self-will. So my self-will, even though my motives were perfect and and I was a super nice guy some of the times, but of course I had the other side of the coin. But self-will led to, I guess, what we might call self-destruction. And so I am going to talk a little bit about my recovery experience, but I think my recovery experience is a valid, my recovery experience is a valid spiritual experience. And I think that recovery is one of the great spiritual systems on the planet. I've certainly seen as much regeneration and spiritual awakening in that program as anywhere else. And I've done a lot of this kind of stuff. But anyway, be that as it may, I stagger into the rooms of recovery 26 years ago, and it was largely suggested to me that I begin to consider and do God's will. And I was like, retching over in the corner, just thinking, this is the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. And I used to make fun of God's will for my first few months. I mean, I would say this out loud. I was not much appreciated by the old timers and the recovery movement when I first came in, because I said I was much more interested in my rich Aunt Martha's will than God's will, because at least I'd get something out of it. And I argued and argued with the wise old timers about God's will, and I it was just the idea of having some external cosmic tyrant running my life who really had no interest in me getting my needs met seemed like the worst idea that I'd ever heard in my entire life. And yet, as a wise one pointed out to me, my own efforts to produce any sort of happiness in life had failed completely. So really what was left? And so finally, there was quite a surrender when I said, okay, God, I don't understand what your will is, but I'm willing to consider it. And this was an argument that I had with my spiritual mentor for weeks and weeks. And one day I walked up to him and I said, what happens if it's God's will for me that I go to Africa and I feed starving babies? And he poked me in the sternum with his bony little finger, which he was wont to do. But he always had this kind of beady-eyed little smile. But he poked me in the sternum and he said, why would he send you? And it really struck me, because it began to dawn on me after listening to so many other humans really discuss what God's will is. And it really revolutionized my thought. So this week we're going to study the notion that God's will for each and every one of us is not an external, burdensome, onerous obligation imposed upon us from the outside in. It's actually the release and the blossoming of the greatest imaginable good, or as one great saint said, the exceedingly, the abundant, above and beyond, the limitless and immeasurable great good favor of God unfolding. God's will, as I've come to learn slowly, painstakingly over these years, is think of the greatest love and joy and bliss that you've ever had in your life so far, multiply it by 1,000,000,000, and then multiply that by 1,000,000,000 and extend that forward throughout all eternity and out throughout all infinity. And you're beginning to scratch the surface of what God's will is. That's all. So that's the topic. And I don't know about you guys, but for me to surrender to God's will, I can't do it once, because my self-will has enormous resilience, and this mortal mind of mine to think that I know better, or I know how to get happy on my own, or my way is better, is enormously reflexive and habitual. So to remember and to be reminded, because I always have to be reminded, and I like to be a helpful reminding person, that God's will is better than anything I could think of, and I'm only scratching the surface. So that'll be our topic. What do you think? You want to get in this will with me? All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.